Them Alive by Nace. Read by Al Richardson. Chapter 11. The women whom Slayer had stripped of their breasts were wailing and screaming by turns, raising their hands as if to stop the blood that poured from their torn bodies, running in circles about the camp, seeking escape from being further eaten by the green insects. But Dyke knew none would get away. The mantises would dine upon every possible bite of these villagers, would leave only scraps when their master moved them on. He let his gaze sweep the green of the trees above, and the close-matching green of the monsters below, a contrast to the red blood that still gushed from the ripped bodies and rushed towards his feet, washing his boots red, the sight of it exciting him, almost as much as the taste did the beasts. He was pleased to note that the blood did not wash away the unendurable smell of his cover, probably because the blood was caking as it reached his boots. It blended into the potion and remained upon him. He muttered fiercely, "If the blood of my 4 enemies drops on my boots, I'll never wash it off. I'll look at it and love it, because it will mean that the men I despise are dead, that my monsters have eaten them alive." He closed his eyes and tried to imagine what Pete's death would do for him. He murmured, "God, it will be like coming from hell and going to heaven. I'll be the man I was before they castrated me. I'll be everything I ever wanted to be, because I'll be the defeated one who came back to life and killed them all." When the slaughter of the villagers was complete, and the blood of the victims had either been washed down the throats of the killers or absorbed into the soft ground, Dyke said, "You are full now, Slayer. We must get our friends back in the truck. We have to be on our way, friend." The oversized mantis always raised his head at the word friend. Dyke was sure he understood that it meant a bond between them. He would obey almost any command if Dyke called him friend. As he began heading the insects towards the truck, Slayer joined in the task, allowing none to fly away, nor even to get out of the line that wound its way out of the shorn village. When the 9 were secured in the truck, by a wire net over the top, Slayer plopped his mammoth self onto the seat beside Dyke, and the journey started. They drove past Ibak. After dark, because Dyke didn't want the townspeople to see Slayer and become curious. And he didn't want to displease the great mantis by making him ride in the back with the others. Slayer was Dyke's friend. They should ride together. Things could not have gone more precisely according to plan. They didn't encounter even one person in their ride through the edge of the city, nor in their trip into the mountains. Dyke parked the truck a mile from the Stewart mansion to await the sunrise. When the daylight touched the high peaks of the misty mountains, blending its golden glow with the blue haze that hung over the lush greenery, Dyke started the truck and drove it close to the fence that surrounded Pete's home, and which, no doubt, the fugitive considered his safeguard from all molesters. Dyke waited until the Stewart family came romping out of the big stone house, all impeccably dressed in white, and began to scatter about the lawn. The native woman was setting a table under tall trees, filling it with a breakfast that made Dyke's taste buds rise to near bursting. He vowed, whispering to Slayer, "I'll eat that luscious meal myself while you're eating the people. I've never had food that tasted as good as that looks. And it seems like forever since I had anything but beef jerky and berries and canned milk and a few crushed coffee beans to wash it down. God, I'll get me a wallop out of sitting down in one of those pink chairs and eating that devil's ham and eggs and hot cakes in front of him, while my mantises tear him limb from limb and pour his blood all over his fancy green lawn. Pete's woman, his wife, Dyke supposed, if Pete had bothered to marry her, came out of the house behind the children carrying a baby. Dyke said, "All right, that makes 8 of them, counting the maid. And we've got 10 mantises. If there aren't a couple of cooks or gardeners or somebody else to add, then some of my insects will have to share their people meat." He motioned to Slayer to stay behind and guard the other mantises as he moved towards the frolicking family that was gathering round the breakfast table. He paused a moment to steady himself. His fury and hatred were building so strongly within him that they shook him through, made him want to draw his gun and shoot Pete Stewart with as many shots as he could, up and down the tall body, into his mouth, into his groin, and finally into his heart. Pete was the meanest one of the 4, the one who never held back from the most vicious of tortures. Pete was the one who had changed Dyke from a man into a eunuch. The others had watched and approved, so they were guilty too, but Pete had done the cutting. Dyke bit his lips and set his teeth. Rage would gain him nothing. He must be cool, self-assured. He must gain control of the scene and keep it no matter what. His anger would soon become elation when Pete's torture started. He would have his revenge. The time would come at last. The day he had waited 11 years to enjoy. He was sure that his smell would precede him, and it did. The wind carried the scent to the family, and every one of them whirled towards him, sniffing the air, in resentment of his intrusion. He walked to the table where they now sat, his gun aimed at Pete's head. "Howdy, old buddy." The man leapt to his feet, facing the gun in amazement. "Am I supposed to know you?" "You will eventually." "Yes." "What do you want?" "You'll know when you remember who I am." Dyke was cool now, but he felt the fury boiling through him. Pete asked, Is it money you want?" "Money is the last thing I'm looking for." "What else could you want of me?" The man's tone was troubled now, as if he might be searching his past for Dyke's face, his voice, his manner. Dyke took off his felt hat, letting the morning breeze ruffle his dark hair, play about with his swarthy cheeks with their seamed scars that Pete's knife had carved so long ago. The man's eyes widened. He frowned, rubbing his forehead. You look like somebody I used to know, but I can't remember who in hell it was. Who are you?" Without answering, Dyke took off his shirt, revealing his chest and stomach, the scars that covered them. Scars that were still red. "Remember me now, Pete? Or shall I take off my pants and let my castration jog your memory?" There was a long pause. The man's face showed a crack in the mask that covered it. He said slowly, I remember you now, Dyke Mellis. But I don't believe it." "You thought that you, Zeb, Kane and Ryan had killed me before you left the Redding Ranch that night, didn't you?" "Hell, I could have sworn we did." "Now you can see you didn't. But I'm going to be certain I kill you, now that it's my turn. When I leave here this morning, there won't be a Stewart left alive." Pete took a step towards him. "Look, Dyke, there's no damn need for us to fight after all these years." That's easy for you to say when you're a whole man. Hell, I'm sorry about what I did to you, pal. I'll make it up to you. Are you stupid enough to think that you can? I've made a hell of a lot of money since I came down here. I'll give you half of it. I told you, money wasn't important to me. Anyway, not as important as seeing you dead. You came here just to kill me? Oh, I thought you'd never figure it out. The other man's face was working now, and slivers of fear pierced the dark cheeks and mouth. But he didn't weaken, nor grovel. Dyke remembered that he never had. He snapped, "Then get it done. Shoot me and be satisfied." Dyke moved to the table, lolled against it, and let his eyes take in the wide-eyed, terrorised family, the delicious breakfast that they hadn't touched. Not yet, old buddy. You'd miss all the fun if you died first. He saw Pete stiffen, his hands clenching into fists. What kind of fun? What kind of fun, you thing? The kind that only a thing could dream up, Pete. A special kind. A mantis kind. A mantis? Praying mantises that will attack and eat you and your nice little family here. Now the man hooted, throwing back his head and letting his derisive laugh ring into the mountains. Any praying mantis I ever saw couldn't kill a grasshopper. Dyke's eyes roved over the table again. The woman's face was ashen, her hands trembling as she clutched the baby. The maid was paused in her steps, stone still. The kid sat silently, open-mouthed, staring at Dyke's gun. He called, "Slayer, come on. It's breakfast time." There was a loud crashing through the fence as the giant mantis made a hole where none had been. He came bounding across the lawn and stopped beside the table and Dyke. Pete's chin dropped. "For God's sake, what is that thing?" "I told you. A praying mantis." "And you've trained it to kill?" "You can bet your damned life I have." Dyke thought, why doesn't the devil beg? Hasn't he got any genuine emotion in him? Or haven't I got to it yet? Will he grovel when Slayer eats his family in front of him? As if reading his mind, or perhaps remembering Dyke's threat of a moment ago, Pete said slowly, unevenly, "My wife and kids never cut you. Have your bug finish me off, but let them go." "Oh no, Pete. Seeing you suffer has been my sole goal for 11 years, and when your family dies one by one, you'll suffer if you're any kind of man." Now the laughter was completely gone from the man. He started to beg. "Dyke, for Christ's sake, lay off Mona and the kids." Dyke did not offer him relief by answering. Pete tensed even more than before, fisting and unfisting his hands, wrinkling his tight forehead into deep creases. "Look, Dyke, pal, I've got 2 businesses going here in Colombia. One's in Bogota, the capital, and it's big. I'll make you my partner." "I have no interest in anybody's partnership." Dyke moved the gun up and down as if looking for the most tender spot on the man. Then he added, "But there is one thing you can do for me." "Christ, anything. "Okay. Tell me where Zeb, Ryan, and Kane are." "Will you let us go if I do?" Dyke didn't answer. Pete went on, "I'll have to take the chance that you will, I guess." If, as you told me, you're any kind of man. Dyke wanted to say, I'm not a man, remember? You made me a eunuch. But he said nothing. Pete hesitated no longer. They're all in the mountains here in Colombia. We got together once in a while, ever since we came here. Zeb's got a house in Manizales, and Cain, built his place in the hills above Nieva. Ryan's on down near Popayan. Will you put that damn gun down now and take that big green bug away from us? Do you see me doing it? But you promised. I promised nothing. I just said there was something you could do for me and you did it. Thank you. Look, pal, you can have controlling interest in both my businesses. I never cared for business ventures, Pete. None of the 5 of us did. 11 years ago. Weren't we going to go our separate roads with our own shares of that robbery? But you tried to steal the whole bag, Dyke. True. But the 4 of you could have beat me up and then let me go. You didn't have to cut me to pieces and leave me for dead. You deserved to die. Then so do you. And that is what you are going to do. Pete's leg was twitching now, moving the spotless white trousers he wore. Dyke had never known him to be this nervous as a boy. He said, I'd give you everything I have if you leave my family alone. You care about them that much, then? For Christ's sake, of course I do. Haven't you ever loved anybody? No. A eunuch can't fall in love, Pete. I've only loved my desire for revenge on you 4 men. He motioned to an iron post that was part of the ornamental fence. Back up to that. No, not unless you promise you won't touch Mona and... Dyke aimed his gun at the man's interlocking fingers and fired once. The shot went through both hands. Blood rushed through the veins and ran down the man's white pants and dripped onto his white shoes and made droplets upon the green grass. Dyke repeated, back up to that post. I'll keep shooting until you do. Pete obeyed. Dyke said, guard them, Slayer. Don't let anybody move until I get this rat devil tied tight. He took a roll of heavy wire from his pocket and wound it around Pete's hands and then the post. He made it so tight that it cut into the wrists and brought blood, mingling the new flow with the blood that still poured from the man's limp hands. He tied the wire around the man's waist and around his feet, thus holding him powerless against the stake. But Pete made no outcry. Dyke thought, maybe he won't give in and sob and beg. God, I'd like to see the tears in his damned eyes, streams of tears that run down his cheeks, run into the blood that I'll have Slayer claw out of his cheeks, so he'll bleed for me the way I bled for him. No other person had moved. All remained terrified, like statues of themselves. Dyke picked up his gun again. Slayer, friend, come here. The beast trotted to his side. Dyke saw that Slayer's bulging eyes were fastened upon Mona and her breasts that were half out of the low-cut dress she wore. Booming, large and black, marvellous dishes for Slayer's gourmet enjoyment. But Dyke pushed him away. He pointed to Pete and simulated a claw with his fingers waving it in front of the coloured man's cheeks. Instantly the beast dug his knives into the face, bringing them down in great slashes. Blood dyed the white suit now, surging from the cheeks that were sliced to the bone. Still, Pete made no sound. Dyke thought, he'll scream when he sees Mona and his children devoured before his eyes. No human being could hold himself from begging then. And Pete's a devil, but he's human too. Dyke invited, "Friend, eat now, have what you will, and I know your first choice will be a woman." In a single bound, Slayer had Mona in his clawed grasp, forcing her to drop the baby, flinging her from the table and onto the ground in front of Dyke and Pete. With one sweep of his gigantic claw, he had the clothes off her beautiful body, and he was upon it with both his great feet. Quickly he slashed off a breast and held it high, letting the blood drip from the rounded heap before he popped it into his mouth and began to chew it with glorious satisfaction, hissing his pleasure loudly as he ate. Beside Dyke, Pete spoke low, hoarsely, in torn syllables. "Christ, no. No, Dyke. Don't let him..." Dyke taunted. "Slayer loves women's breasts more than any other part of human meat, and humans are his favourite meal." The beast sliced off the second breast and carried it above his head, sucking the blood from it, squeezing it to get all the possible red blood from it. Then he ate it with the same delight as he had the other. Mona was writhing under the great insect, kicking, moving her arms in terror, but being unable in any way to escape. She was screaming, crying, "Let me go! Jesus, don't kill me! Don't eat me any more!" But Slayer ate on, seeming to take the woman's screams for encouragement. He dug his claws into one of the gaps left by her breast, and he brought his cut the length of her torso, slicing her in half. He bent his head at once and began to suck up the blood that gushed from the open body, filling his mouth with a crimson flow, letting it run down his green body and stain the grass around him. Still, the woman lived. Dyke knew she would not die until the beast tore out her heart or snapped off her head. He said to himself very low, "God, I love the sight of a woman being eaten. I'm a firecracker, just watching. I'm buoyed up halfway to the sky, but I'll be twice as high when I see Slayer eat Pete. God, I can hardly wait." He looked at Pete, saw tears running down the black man's mutilated face where the blood was caking, then joining the fresh blood that washed him. A hoarse cry burst from the bleeding man, a sob that was close to insane with suffering, with pleading. "Dyke, take him off her. Make him let her go. Dyke, you vicious murderer, you. Christ, don't let him eat her to death. Please." That's what I wanted to hear, you begging me, crying for me. It will help you remember how you slashed me that night on the ranch. You made me a shell of a man, only half human. All you lacked was eating me, and I'm sure you'd have done that if you could have. You wanted me dead then. All right, I want you dead now. You and every other living soul in your house. Pete closed his eyes, letting his head sag upon his chest. His tears came freely now, mixing into the blood, dampening his torn face, his ruined hands, his black body with its once white covering. Slayer was dining greedily now, tearing flesh from the female's shoulders and arms, from her legs and hips, munching the whole of it, happily, pausing only to belch now and then, falling again to the broken body with renewed joy. The blood was gushing faster than he could suck it into his cavernous throat, and the dark stain deepened, pouring the woman's life juice from her being, reddening all it touched. As the mantis raised his head with the sucked blood still filling his mouth and spilling from it, he gulped part of it, and let the rest fly in a red splash upon the crying baby in the chair. It flung drops upon the maid, and upon the horrified children who were now clinging together and screaming at the top of their young voices. Dyke thought, God, I'm glad Pete built his house up here in the mountains where he hasn't got any close neighbours. They can yell all they want and nobody will hear them to come and help. All they can hope for is death, and they'll get it. God, they'll all get it for Pete's torturing me. Slayer had chewed up a good part of the flesh from Mona's body, and he paused to decide where to eat her next. He spied her eyes and clawed them out one at a time, eating them with his customary relish. Then he began to claw at the organs inside her torso. First came the liver, which he chewed with plain pleasure, close to the joy he'd found eating her breasts. Then he tore the stomach from her and slit it apart, clawing it to bits, selecting the bites that appealed to him. Next he fished out the intestines and tossed them into long ripples ahead of them, pulling them back a bit at a time, swishing the bloody coils back and forth as he swallowed them bite after bite. Last of all, he ripped out her heart and let the blood drip from it into his mouth before he took small bites at first, and then crushed it in his claws, dropping the bleeding mass into his gullet, chewing and swallowing, his eyes shining. Mona lay dead before them all, her halved form emptied of the organs and flesh. Pete was sobbing beside Dyke, no longer pleading, but only crying, sobbing with all the grief a strong man could endure without dying himself. Dyke said, "There's another woman for you, Slayer, friend." The mantis's eyes had already found the plump maid, and had taken in the sight of her right breast that trembled far ahead of her. He bounded to her and threw her to the ground. Dyke said, "I'm going to my car for a minute, but I'll have my gun on you kids every second. If anybody moves, I'll shoot him dead. You hear me?" They nodded, their faces shocked, their eyes wide. Dyke backed towards the road where his truck was parked, keeping his face turned towards the children in their terrified huddle. He knew that he would have to veer his gaze from them long enough to release the 9 mantises in the truck, but he was sure that Slayer would not allow a living thing to escape. He would watch. If any child made a dive for freedom, the beast would be upon him, tearing him to ribbons. Dyke pulled the wire from the truck bed and called, "Food, friends, there's food for all of you. Come and see. I'll fill every one of you." They left the truck in a mammoth scramble, falling over each other to reach the open air. Dyke kept calling and waving to them, and so accustomed were they to receiving their meals from him that they fell into line behind him, followed him through the fence and on to Pete Stewart's lawn, where Slayer sat hissing happily as he chewed upon a breast from the denuded servant woman. Dyke waved the insects forward. "Take them, friends. Tear them to pieces and spill their blood all over this velvet grass. Eat them whatever way you want to." Pete opened his eyes and shrieked, "No, Dyke, not the kids too. Don't let those things eat my kids. I couldn't stand that. I'd lose my mind." Dyke turned from the sobbing man whose writhing hands had cut the wires deeper and deeper into his wrists, until the blood was falling from them in a steady trickle that bid fair to grow greater. But when Dyke didn't answer him, Pete made no further pleas, seeming to understand that his enemy's revenge could only be satisfied by the deaths of every Stewart here. The newly released insects were seizing the children and dragging them from their hold upon each other, feasting on the young bodies. One mantis took the baby and tore off its head. When he'd swallowed the little form in 3 bites, he cracked the head and clawed the delicacy of the little brain from it. Sitting back, he held the head in his claws as he dug again and again into it for the last of the available bits. All of the beasts were eating now, some claiming a child alone, others sharing a body. Slayer, apparently sated temporarily, moved from the native woman after he'd devoured both her large, round breasts, squeezing milk from the nipples and ducts, and blood from the veins. Dyke called, "Slayer, friend, come here." The insect trotted to his master. "Friend, let the others have what is left. You can't be hungry. And if you are, you won't be for long. You're going to have the man, as soon as his family is eaten, to the last bite of flesh on their bones." He pointed toward Pete. Slayer made a dive for the black man and ripped his claws through the white suit, tearing the flesh under it, bringing blood from the jagged cuts he made. But Dyke motioned the beast back. "Not yet, friend. He must wait until the slaughter here is done. He must see everything in his world die, as he thought he made me die all those years ago. When he has nothing left to watch, then you may eat him alive too. And I want you to do it slowly. Make him suffer the way he enjoyed watching me suffer. I want his death to come slowly. Very slowly, friend." Slayer's eyes went over to the other mantises that were fast filling their bellies with the human meat of Pete Stewart's offspring. He raised his face to Dyke's, and the man felt the insect's query. "The man will be mine alone." "Yours alone, friend. When the others are devoured in full, we will put the other mantises back in the truck. Then you and I will come back here. And you will have the man for yourself." Slayer settled beside Dyke contentedly. The mantises ate the children fast, no doubt because the young ones were smaller than the human meat they were used to, and also because they were ravenously hungry. Blood now covered the bodies of killers and victims, blood that ran red over the lawn. Dyke started to dip his boots into it, but pulled himself back. He would not wade in this blood. He would wait for Pete's blood, the blood from his guts, as Slayer tore them from his living body and ate them for Pete to see. When the flesh was consumed from all the children's bodies, along with the inner organs, some mantises began breaking the bones and sucking the marrow from them. Others were cracking the heads open and dining upon the brains, gloating over each succulent part. 2 of the beasts had moved to the bodies of Mona and the servant, the 2 that Slayer had mutilated, but had not stripped of their total worth of food. There were bones to break and suck, heads to smash and empty. And this the beasts did, savouring the bodies until there was not an edible part of them left. At last Dyke told Slayer, "Friend, let's get the fighters into the truck. Come on, help me." Slayer studied him with bright eyes and followed as he coaxed the other mantises into line and started them towards the road. Close to being sated now, they went willingly, stepping up into the truck when Dyke or Slayer prodded them, making no protest as the wire net was pulled across the top. The red-headed insect ran ahead of the man, bounding across the lawn towards the last victim, the one that had been promised to him alone. Before Dyke could stop him, The great green creature had clawed off half of Pete's face and chewed it to bits. Following that act, by tearing off the black man's clothes, letting the expensive white togs drop into the sea of blood around the man's feet, the blood of his wife and children, as well as his own. Dyke started to interfere with the beast's meal, but decided to let Slayer go ahead. It might be fun to watch this old enemy be eaten at the stake. Plenty of people have been burned at the stake, but had anyone before been eaten there? Dyke sat down at the breakfast table and began to eat the sumptuous breakfast without taking his eyes off the man's mutilation. There was food for 6 hungry people here, and Dyke helped himself to portions of all of it, delighting in the ham and eggs he'd not tasted in years, the hotcakes and syrup that reminded him of the pancakes his mother had cooked, back in another life somewhere. Slayer was snapping off the black man's arms and legs, munching the flesh he chewed from the bones. The torso hung only by the wire around its middle. Dyke rose from the table, feeling himself grow taller with every passing second. He proclaimed to himself, and to Pete, and to the world, "This is what I've made myself live for. This is revenge, the kind of revenge I've known I had to have, and it's the happiest day of my life in these past 11 years. You're not a man any longer, Pete Stewart, you're a thing, and only half of that, but I'm a man, a real male, because I've got power. More power than any man ever had. Who cares about sexual arousal and fulfillment? Not me. All I want is the power to kill my enemies, and I've got it. God, I've got it for sure. I'm happy seeing you die, Pete. I'm the happiest man in the world." He moved closer to the dying man as he demanded, "Didn't you ever think I might live through that night in Texas and come after you, Pete?" The other man groaned in his unmitigated pain. "No, damn you, no. You were supposed to be dead. But I was too tough to die. And I'm going to be twice as tough after this morning. I'm going to be 2 feet taller after I've seen you die." Pete made no reply. Slayer raised a claw and ripped open the body trunk. Dyke sprang forward carrying a water pitcher, emptying it as he leapt to the side of the killer and his victim. Holding the pitcher against the body, he caught part of the blood that poured out. Moving it about, he finally filled it halfway. He rinsed the blood round and round in the pitcher, taking it back and forth before Pete's eyes. "I've never drunk blood, old buddy, but I'm going to take one swallow of yours, the way I'm going to down a spoonful of Zeb's and Kane's and Ryan's before I let Slayer drink the rest of it." He raised the pitcher and let a few drops of the red fluid drip into his throat. It had a warm taste that fired him to new heights, sent his spirits soaring into space. But he wanted no more. His act had been done solely to increase his enemy's suffering. He tipped the pitcher and poured the blood down Slayer's throat. The mantis swallowed loudly, hissing, belching, enjoying the drink. Dyke went back to his breakfast, eating without any nausea whatever, as Pete was torn to shreds by the insect's claws. Slayer sucked up and down the body for more blood, caught great gulps of it, until he'd nearly exhausted the supply. Then he ripped the man open and reached for the inner organs. Pete was dying, perhaps dead already. But Dyke kept up his taunting, satisfying his own vengeance, if for nothing else. Nobody leaves Dyke Mellis for dead. You hear me, Pete Stewart? You robbed me of blood and flesh, and nobody stopped you. Now I'm robbing you the same way. All at once Dyke jumped to his feet, moved to the man on the post and pointed at the man's groin. Bite that from him, friend. Castrate this man the way he castrated me. You hear? Slayer obeyed, clawing off the maleness, chewing it down. When it was gone, he went on to the liver and then the stomach. The heart had stopped beating when he tore it from the body and devoured it with hissing pleasure. On and on he ate, pausing as he savoured all the flesh, sucked all the bones, broke the head to drain it of its sweet meat. When at last the great green insect sat back with his belly distended by Stewart meat, there was nothing remaining of Pete but a pile of bones, and the one white suit that was soggy with his blood. Dyke finished his breakfast, eating all he could hold. When he was filled to discomfort, he rose and called Slayer to leave the bones. He was again sniffing. Come on, friend. It's time to start after the next enemy and dispose of him. Give him as much suffering as we gave old Pete. Then we'll go home and rest in our Malpello hut. He surveyed the cluttered lawn, the grass with the drops of blood still glistening in the brightness of the green. He said, if somebody finds this mess, they'll call in the law. And if the lawmen come looking, they may find me. But if they do, it's no matter. It'll be worth whatever happens. I heard Pete beg. I saw him cry. And I watched him die.